every person could be you though. A pretty guy with a halo. But who am I kidding, please now? I gotta realize that you
Hello everyone, Eric Marks here again with FindingMiddleEarth.com, and today I'm doing my full review on the Nikon D850. And before we get started, if you guys head over to my website at FindingMiddleEarth.com, just click the big subscribe button in the top right hand corner and you'll get instant access to a free 45-minute video going over all my landscape photography gear, my camera bags, stuff that I like to keep inside the bag, outside the bag, tripods, all that good stuff. I'll be updating that video soon as well, since I've gotten the D850 and some new tripods and stuff. So if you join that mailing list, the newsletter list, you'll get access to all that for free every time that I update the video. Okay, so I've owned this camera now for almost 2 months. It'll be 2 months next week. So you guys know that I'm not the kind of person that likes to be the first guy on YouTube, the first person on the market with the review. I don't care about that. I like to get the camera, use it, really put it through its paces, and then give you guys valuable information based off my experience with the camera. Now, I didn't even buy this D850 until 6 or 7 months after it came out. So I'm definitely late to the game, but this is the biggest request that I get ever since I've bought this camera is two things. Number one, Eric, where is your review? And Eric, how does the D850 stack up to your Fujifilm X-T2? So in my opinion, the X-T2 question is kind of a silly question, but I'm going to address that in another video anyway. So let's go and get into the review. I'm going to do this review in categories, and I have my computer with some notes pulled up here just to make sure I don't forget anything. I want to give you guys all the information that I've found, and almost all of it is very positive, as you would expect, because there's already been a lot of D850 videos out, and I still am in firm belief that this is the best DSLR on the market currently. So here are some of the categories. We're going to be looking at ergonomics and button layout. We're going to talk about battery life. We're going to talk about the autofocus system. Dynamic range and ISO is going to be one category, and then last but not least, I'm going to answer the question, should you buy the D850 or the D810? Because that is a huge question that I was faced with when this came out, and a lot of people are still trying to decide if they want to go with this or a used D810. So we'll talk about that at the end. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the first category, ergonomics and button layout. All right, so as for the overall ergonomics and build quality of the D850, there's not really any complaints. You guys know that compared to the D810, which I shot with for years, this definitely does have the deeper grip like on the D500, and I believe like the one they have on the Nikon D750. And at first I didn't really like that. I thought that I was gonna end up finding that kind of uncomfortable, because I really did at first. I thought that clenching my fingers inward too much was gonna pose for some uncomfortable arthritis type problems, because I do have a little bit of problems with my hands since I clench them so often with a keyboard. But it's actually been okay. I've been fine with it. There's not really a big complaint there with the grip. You definitely do have a better handle over the camera with that grip. I didn't like it at first, but it's definitely growing on me. Also, you'll notice the biggest thing about the camera ergonomically versus the D810 is that it does not have a pop-up flash. I love that they took away the pop-up flash. There were definitely some unhappy people. I love it because it reminds me of my D4, D4S bodies, where it's just a big solid chunk of magnesium alloy, and it's just much less probability for the elements and rain, dirt, and all that stuff to be able to get into the camera. It's just all closed up and nicely sealed. And then I also purchased the D850 hot shoe cover separately, so my hot shoe is nice and sealed off with this nice thick rubber cover as well. So I'm not worried about any kind of weather or anything getting inside the body of the D850. I'm very, very confident in its ability to remain weather sealed. Okay, that doesn't mean waterproof, but it does mean weather sealed, so you still want to be smart with your camera. Let's see. The next thing is The as far as ergonomics go, the weight and size is slightly heavier than my D810 was, but in the field, you know, it's just a Nikon camera. It's just a Nikon DSLR. DSLRs are heavy and they're big and chunky, and that's just all there is to it. You know, I don't really notice that much of a difference with the D810. I might if I had them side by side holding them, but you know, I have my L bracket on here, and I just don't really care about weight when I'm shooting with this camera. But it is as far as the fit in the hand. It is just beautiful. I love the way it feels. It just works for me. I like the way everything's just kind of in my hands. I've always liked the Nikon menu system, so it just works really good for me. Now let's talk a little bit about the buttons and the button layout. So this D850 is the first D800 series camera to have the illuminated buttons on the back. So I really love that because that does remind me of my Nikon D4, which I love that it had the illuminated buttons because I did use that camera for low light event photography quite often. And it was wonderful in low light to be able to just flick the light switch here and have everything light up on the back and you know where everything is. I've been a Nikon shooter for so long, I kind of know stuff by heart, but on this camera, as far as button layout, they did switch a few things up. So we do have the brand new ISO button right here on the right side of the camera. It used to be over here. So the ISO switching used to be a two-finger thing. You'd hold one button over here and you'd swap it with the dial. So now it's just, you know, everything with one hand. It's just one finger and then you roll the dial. So I do really like that they switched the ISO button around, even though I still, every time I pick this up and I want to change my ISO, I still just by habit reach over here, and that's just from shooting with the D810 for so long. So it will grow on me. One thing that I wish you know, would have been nice about button layout, and I don't know the science behind this, if this was impossible to do, but I really wish that they would have just killed off the video record button and built the video record button into the shutter button. And they would have put the mode dial over here as well. It would have been cool to have a mode, ISO, and the exposure comp all on this right side. So that way my mode dial, I can go from manual to aperture to shutter priority, all with this one side, you know, all with this one side of the camera, just with one hand. I can just hold the camera like this and control ISO, mode, and the exposure comp. So I got 2 out of 3, no big complaints there. You know, it's not a end of the world thing, but it would be nice to be able to have the mode dial over here, or even something else instead of the video. Even white balance would have been nice for custom Kelvin to be all done with one hand. But again, you know, not a big complaint, just something that would have been nice. But again, I don't know the science behind that. I don't know if they couldn't have done it something with the electronics of the camera. I don't really care about all that stuff. That's just something that I think would have been nice and more convenient for me. Another thing about the buttons, so they killed off the AE lock button that used to be next to the AF on, which I'm fine with because we gained the joystick or sub-selector knob, whatever they call it. And I love this. Ergonomically, and the feel of it and the placement of it is perfect because it's big and chunky and it has teeth on it that grip my thumb. That's probably my favorite part about the usability of this camera on the back is that every time that I want to quickly swap a focus point around, it's so nice to be able to just, no matter where my thumb falls, if my eye is up to the camera, no matter where my thumb falls, I know that big chunky thing is going to be there. It's whether it hits the joint of my thumb or the tip of it, it's super grippy and easy to control. And I shoot with a Fujifilm X-T2, and the X-T2 also has like a little joystick, and it's much smaller and doesn't really have much of a grippy feel, and so my thumb actually slips off of that quite often if my hands are sweaty from hiking. And this, every single time my hand fell on this, I just knew where it was. Those teeth gripped my thumb, and it was just perfect. So I love the feel of that. I don't really care about the AE lock button being gone. As long as I have my AF on and my joystick, I am a happy boy. Next here, let's see, we have the loss of the CF card finally, which I'm glad they got rid of the CF card, which was on my D810, which had a CF card slot and an SD card slot. So now here in the D850 we have SD and XQD. I don't have a problem with that, but if I could have picked the way they built it, I would have just rather them had gone full XQD, just done XQD in both slots. And that's mainly just because I know that's kind of where the future is going. They're faster cards, they're becoming less and less expensive, and I would have just rather them put dual XQD cards in there. But I'm not going to complain about one SD and one XQD. You know, I'm not a sports shooter that has to have dual backups at insanely fast speeds, but it just would have been nice. So let's see, anything else into this category? The viewfinder. So the viewfinder on this camera is I think it's a 0.76 magnification, and it's one of the widest widest I think it's a widest viewing angle viewfinder right now on the Nikon DSLRs. It might be that the D500 is the same thing, but it's noticeably wider of a view than the D810, and it's big, beautiful, brilliant, bright. It's a pleasure to use on this. So I love the big viewfinders. That's one of my favorite things about the DSLR cameras in general, is that, especially the Nikon, is that they always have these big, bright, beautiful viewfinders. Love that. The last thing I'll mention in this category is the display. The display is very, very rigid. I had some concerns about this going in because I just didn't, I've never loved the idea of having a huge chunky DSLR that's weather sealed and rigid and then have a screen that's kind of removable. You know, in my dreams of dreams, right, I wish that the screen could be fully articulating, could come all the way out and still be just as rigid as it was if it were just built in, but I know that's not 100% possible. But I've been really impressed. This screen actually is very, very rigid. It has a very nice tension. When you grab it out, it doesn't feel flimsy at all. I mean, these brackets that hold it on are very, very rigid. It's very, very well built. It doesn't feel cheap or flimsy at all. And that means something coming from me, because I'm always a little skeptical about moving displays. I think they're just a little scary sometimes to operate. So this one is up there with the best of them, if not the best I've ever used. But it would have been awesome if it was fully articulating, even though that would have been, it would have been a little, I guess, more of a feat for Nikon to jump over, because they've never done that before, at least on the D800 series bodies, or even the D750 was the same kind of screen. I know Nikon has it on some of their lower end cameras. I don't know what models, but it is fully articulating. So it would be cool to see the fully articulating screen eventually come over to these, as long as they could keep it just as rigid and well built as it is right now. So I love that. Okay, I think that about wraps it up for this. Let's go ahead and jump into the next category. Battery life. All right, so for battery life on this camera, I was also a little skeptical after reading all the reviews online. Many blogs, for some reason, said this thing had like horrible battery life. I never experienced really bad battery life. I know this camera does have the new ENEL 15A battery, but the ENEL 15s that you've used on your D810 or D800, those still do work in this camera. But the ENEL 15A came out with, I think it just came out with this camera. It might have come out with the D500, I'm not sure. But it's been okay. The battery life increased significantly once I just turned this camera into airplane mode. So it's not syncing with my phone, GPS, it's not doing SnapBridge. I think SnapBridge is a nightmare to use anyway. So I just have this in basic, just airplane mode turned off. And it's definitely, I've noticed the battery life extend once I just turn all that stuff off. I just don't use it. I don't need it. I don't really care so much about GPS tagging, because I typically always know where I'm going, and I take a picture once I'm there at least once with my phone, and then I can just tag that in Lightroom anyway, and then just sync that to all the photos. So it's not a big concern for me. But the battery life, I guess for once I turned on airplane mode, I shot for 2 days straight without charging the battery. And I didn't shoot all day long, but I did a lot of live view shooting in pretty cold weather, in about 30 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit weather for 2 days. And at the end of those 2 days, before charging the battery, I still had about roughly 20% of the battery left. So I was actually pretty impressed. I haven't had any big troubles with the battery, but I did notice that when I had everything syncing to my phone and I was trying to play around with SnapBridge, and I did have the GPS kind of writing back to my phone, I did notice a significant drop in the battery life. So I've been pretty impressed. There's not too much else to say. I didn't do any like battery stress tests where I just left it on 4K recording in live view. I might do those in the future, but I'm sure there's already a million other videos out there like that. For my shooting, battery life is fantastic, so no complaints there. So let's go ahead and move on to the next category. Autofocus system. Okay, so as for the autofocus system, this is probably where you'll notice the biggest improvement if you're coming from a previous Nikon DSLR, especially the D810 or the D800 series, any other D800 line. The autofocus system is a dramatic change here. So this has 153 autofocus points. As far as the AF area coverage in the viewfinder, I think Nikon says it's about 25 to 30% larger than that of the D810, so it is better coverage, which is nice. And then the D810, the previous autofocus system was the 51-point autofocus system, which was decent, but it was not any, it was no good for tracking or any kind of wildlife really. If you wanted to track anything, you would always pick up your D4, D4S, or your D7200 even could have beat the D810. But the D850 is a pleasure to use for tracking. I have actually had fun testing this out on wildlife situations, and I've been really impressed with the tracking capability. Another thing that I've been really impressed with is the low light autofocus acquisition. This thing can basically see in the dark, which makes me happy because there's multiple times where I still shoot the occasional event for museums and places that are just notoriously known for low light, and this thing autofocuses in just, I mean, what it seems like just pitch black. It's not actually pitch black, but this thing can basically see in the dark. So I love the autofocus low light acquisition of this. It's just super snappy. This is the lens that I have on here now is the 50mm 1.4, which this lens is known for being just a sluggish, slow piece of crap basically for autofocus. It's very, very slow. But on the D850, this actually pushes this lens to be pretty acceptable. Now, the lens is always going to hold back the camera to a point, obviously. You can have the fastest autofocusing camera in the world, and you put this lens on and it's not going to be so fast anymore. But it's actually pretty snappy with this camera. It's much better than it was on my D810. But that's just, that's just for what I've used this for. I like just using this for my daughter and some family photos. And as far as autofocus tracking for my daughter, she's 2 years old, so she runs around everywhere, and that's a really good test. If you're a parent and you have a kid and you want to do some autofocus testing, just tell your kid to go run around a playground and track them, and it's a really good test. So I did that, and my hit rate was really, really good with this. So I'm not a wildlife photographer or professional sport, so I'm not going to touch too long about the actual tracking capability, but I did notice two sections in the menu where you can kind of tweak the autofocus a little bit. So there's one section which gives you 5 little slots of settings, and I think it's from, let me make sure I have the wording correct here so I don't screw this up, because I know someone will correct me in the comments. Let's see, so yeah, so there's 5 settings from quick to delayed, and I'll throw up a menu screen on the screen right now, and you can see those 5 little slots, and I just played around with those, and I can typically get the right formula for myself within 2 or 3 minutes of shooting, and each one affects the autofocus and how it tracks. Just a slightly from if you're going to have distractions from the camera between you and your camera and the subject, or if you're going to have a really, really bright highlights behind your subject. Each one kind of tweaks the autofocus a little bit for different situations. I haven't used it enough yet to tell you exactly which setting is for what, but I can tell you that to have an extra bit of customization to the autofocus tracking is nice, because that's one thing I love about the X-T2 is that there's all those AFC custom settings. And then there's another customizable setting as well. And again, let me make sure I have the lingo correct for this. There's a subject motion setting, which gives you 3 slot settings from erratic to steady. So you can either put it on erratic or a steady subject, and then there's a slot right in between. I normally just leave mine right in between, and that has done good for everything so far, but I'm assuming if you put it on erratic, it's for probably birds in flight, I would imagine, that are just flying all over the place and you're just doing all you can to track them. Again, not a professional wildlife photographer, so take what I say in that respect with a grain of salt, but everything that I've tried it on so far has worked very well with tracking. I love the group area AF that they introduced to the D810. It carried on over to the D850, and the group area AF actually tracks well with this camera, so I love that. And if we reverse to the first category for a second, which was buttons, ergonomics and button layout, I do actually use, you can customize the PV button, and you have another function button on here on the front, and I actually have one of these buttons customized to, when I hold it, it actually swaps from group autofocus to single point. You can just hold it down and it'll just swap back and forth from group to single, and that's actually really handy, so that if you're tracking something that is a larger subject, or even like a flock of birds or something, and you want to do the group, you can get that wider group area AF where it clusters the points together, and then if you quickly want to hone in on one specific point or one specific animal, then you can let go and it'll go back to your single point, and you can track it with a single point. So I have been using that. That's been pretty handy. And let's see what else we have here under autofocus system. So autofocus in live view, not much to say about that. It still sucks. It's just same old Nikon. Nikon hasn't really figured out how to do really good live view autofocus yet. The Canon dual pixel autofocus is still going to be your best bet when it comes to video AF and live view autofocus. It's definitely better. It's much better than the D810. I do really enjoy the touch to focus, but I would never just live view focus for an actual professional setting like an event or something. It's not going to be the same snappy autofocus system like it's going to be if you're using your optical viewfinder and your live view. They're two totally different ball games there. You're not going to be happy with the speed of just the live view autofocus. So just, you know, I use that when I'm on tripods and I just want to touch a specific part of my composition or a specific thing. It's really great for that, but it's not great if you're actually shooting like a wedding or something. It's just, you know, if you've had Nikon cameras, you know, live view it just sucks. So as far as live view autofocus, again, I do like there's this new function and I don't know if it's brand new because I don't own a D5 or a D500. Those two cameras might have it, I'm not sure, but it's new to me, where you can take the focus point, the autofocus box on live view, and you actually shrink the point so that you can kind of hone in on maybe you know, a subject's eye or a person's eye or an animal's eye or something, or just a smaller portion of the scene. And that actually came in handy quite a few times. I was shooting some horses and a deer from a little bit further away. And when I zoomed in, kind of punched in on the live view to try to get on their eye, I noticed that the box was so big that it was even like swallowing their whole head. So there is a great little setting, which I'll just put some video of on the screen now, where you can actually take the live view point, or the box rather, and just shrink that so you can hone in on specific points like an eye or a face or something like that. So that actually does come in really handy. I like that. The last thing there's two other things. The second to last thing under this category is going to be focus peaking. It's awesome that they brought that to the DSLR. There's 3 settings of peaking. I just use setting number 2, and I use red as my color. I think you can use yellow or blue as a color. There might even be a green, I'm not sure. I don't know what other colors, but I use the red color. But if you don't, a lot of people don't like the red color, so you can use something else. But you can change your colors, and you can change your focus setting to where it can be like really, really high peaking, or there's 1, 2, and 3. Again, I just use right in the middle at number 2. And that works really good for me. It works really good for video, so I have been really pleased with that. And then you guys know I have the Zeiss Milvus 21mm lens, which is a manual focus prime lens, and I have been using it on that just to see what it does. Even though I'm comfortable, just every time I put on the Zeiss lens, I pretty much just crank it to infinity, and I'm good to go. But it is cool to use focus peaking with that just to make sure that everything is nice and sharp all the way through where I want it to be. Okay, so the last thing here is, and I added this in last minute to this category because when I was doing all my research on this camera before I bought it, there was this whole like sponsored article going around. I don't know what blog started it, but this like group of people found that the Nikon D850 takes blurry images, and there's this big defect with the camera. The autofocus system is messed up or something, and it just kept like these sponsored ads everywhere, like on Facebook and Twitter, just kept popping up of the D850 takes blurry images. And I just want to straighten that out a little bit because I know what that is, because I actually have a friend that experienced the same thing, and I had to kind of help straighten him out a little bit. So what happens is someone that wants to get into photography, or even someone that's been into photography, okay, ends up getting a large sum of money, or else they've already had this large sum of money, and they say, hey, I'm going to go to the camera store, I'm going to take up photography as a profession or as a hobby. And I'm going to go to the camera store and I'm going to say, hey, give me the best camera money you can buy right now for this kind of photography. They'll hand them over the Nikon D850, right, if they're a Nikon shooter. And these people will be ecstatic. They just got a 46 megapixel camera, top of the line camera. They'll go home and they'll shoot with it like they have with their, let's say they upgraded from a D7200 or something, okay? And they'll shoot with it like that, and they'll take it to their family reunion, and they'll take hundreds of photos, and they'll promise all these people, I'll email you the photos, it's gonna be great. And what happens is they get home and it's all blurry. And the reason why this happens is because, sorry I had to go through that whole story, by the way, I just wanted to set this up because this is what happens most of the time. And the reason why it's so blurry is because these people have very bad technique with the camera. Number one, the way they hold the camera, and number two, they don't really understand the shutter speed to focal length ratio when you're hand holding a camera. And VR or anything doesn't even come into play. Don't even think about it. Just think about pure, get VR and IS out of the picture. If you're just hand holding a camera at a certain focal length, the regular shutter speed that you typically want on a camera, you're probably going to want to double that. And if you can, triple it on the D850, because this is a 46 megapixel sensor. So what I've been telling people that have actually been reaching out to me and telling me this, so I've even had people tell me, hey, have you had any problems with the D850? Mine takes blurry pictures. And it's like, no, it doesn't take blurry pictures. The problem is your technique. And so I'll get responses that say, well, why am I all, that's not true. Why do I just now have bad technique? And the answer to that is you don't just now have bad technique. It's that now you have a camera whose sensor and resolution can show it to you. Now it shows you your bad technique. And this isn't to be mean or to attack anyone. It's just saying that when you have this high resolution of a camera, the 46 megapixels, you have to really think about what's that showing. It's rendering every little detail that happens in the scene and the person behind the camera. So 99% of the time, your blurry images on any camera, especially on this one, is going to be user error, okay? The way you hold the camera, the way you brace the lens, brace the camera, the closer to your body. I mean, if I'm shooting with a 70 to 200, I always almost have it. If it's not on a tripod, I like to shoot it the way that I like to shoot rifles. I'll just kind of prop it up on my elbow just as an extra support system. And this thing, you know, I have very, very much confidence that this thing is going to keep it super stable. I create kind of a human gimbal out of myself. So it's typically all user error or bad camera technique. So I just want you to keep that in mind, because since I've owned this camera, I've had so many D850 emails and questions that I've just kind of ignored, and I'm putting in this video because I can't get to everyone's questions. But a lot of them have said, my D850 takes blurry images, does yours? And so I'll respond to those and be like, no, just watch my review and you'll understand. So yeah, there's nothing wrong with the autofocus system. There's nothing wrong with this camera. You just have to learn how to wield the 46 megapixel sensor, because it is a beast in itself. And that can be for the good or bad, depending on how you use it. Okay, I think that is it for autofocus system. Let's go ahead and hop into the next category. Dynamic range and ISO. All right, so as for the dynamic range and ISO performance of the D850, let's first attack the dynamic range section, because it'll be pretty quick. So I've always been a huge fan of Nikon dynamic range. Even my Nikon D7200 is still just a beast at dynamic range. It beats out my X-T2, beats out my X-T1. The D7200 was, I think, only 0.2 stops away from being tied with the D810. It's just Nikon dynamic range has always been just superior. So I expected nothing less with the D850. And compared to the D810, I've noticed two things. Number one, I've noticed that the highlights are actually a little better on the D850. They recover a little cleaner. They recover, I don't know in terms of how many stops. It's not like this just tipped over to 15, 16 stops of dynamic range. I think the D810 was at like 14.9 stops, somewhere around there. So this one, I would say it is almost tied. It's just a little bit better. It's a hair better in recovering the highlights than the D810. And that's just from my experience, since I've been working with D810 files for years. I've noticed that this does recover highlights a little cleaner. And then in the shadows, I think the shadows are about the same. However, I've done a few indoor shoots, like architecture or some big, like some older cathedrals and stuff. And if you're indoors, even on a tripod, locked off, long exposure, recovering the shadows indoors for some reason in certain lighting conditions is a little bit muddy, just a little bit more color noise. It's nothing that presents a huge problem. You know, it can be fixed with some Lightroom noise reduction and some quick color noise reduction. It's nothing huge that's going to ruin your images, but it's just a little bit funky in the shadows in certain indoor situations. Those were things that I didn't really notice with my D810, because I shot real estate photography for a long time with my D810 and my D800E, and I never really noticed that. So, I'm not going to say there's a problem with the D810 shadows. It's just something that I noticed. But in landscape photography situations, every situation I've been, it's been, like I said, about the same as the D810, a hair better in the highlights, which I'm not going to complain about. So fantastic dynamic range. As far as ISO performance, so I believe Nikon claims that the D850 is one stop better, so a full stop better than the D810 in ISO performance. I didn't find that in my experience. Before I sold off my D810, I took a little ISO, just a quick little test in my office here, where I shot an old Lord of the Rings book at different ISO settings. So I did the same thing with my D850, side by side in the same lighting, same everything, and I didn't really notice much of a difference until maybe ISO 6400. The D850 was a good bit cleaner there, but then you take the D850 to 12,800, and every review or blog that I saw about the D850, most of them were like, man, the 12,800 on the D850 is so clean. I would shoot it all day long. There's a whole new world open to low light shooters. This is like the Sony A7S. Well, I can tell you from someone who has many friends that swear by the Sony A7S for low light performance, this still can't touch the A7S or A7S II in low light performance. But I will tell you that I would be comfortable shooting with this if I were shooting a wedding in the real world, I would be comfortable shooting with this at 6400 to 8000 ISO probably. And then obviously if I had to get the shot, I'd bump it up to 12,800, but I would know that there would be some post-production work and I would just do some noise reduction, and that's fine, and that would be fine. It would look great, I would still deliver it to the client, everything would be fine, but at 12,800, the tonal values start to shift a little bit in a weird way. There's some green tints that start to creep their way in the shadows. Color noise definitely starts to be introduced, but in my opinion, this isn't a downside because they upped the resolution by 10 megapixels from the D810 to the D850, and they kept the ISO performance a little bit better than the D810. So that's actually a huge feat in my opinion. So a lot of people would say, oh, Nikon claims it's a stop better, this is a horrible camera or whatever, but no, it's the fact that a 46 megapixel camera has the capability to do higher ISOs like 6400 and 8000, that's super impressive. So if you're asking me, should you, can you shoot a wedding with this or anything? Yeah, you can, anything with this. This is a very, very versatile camera now that they have packed the high resolution with the autofocus tracking and all that and the low light acquisition. You can do anything with this. If you're a journalist, buy it. If you're a wildlife photographer, buy it. Sports, buy it. I mean, I think this is just a fantastic camera. So yeah, don't take that as Eric from Finding Middle Earth said you can't shoot weddings because the ISO performance. It's fantastic. So especially for the 46 megapixels, again, that's just a feat in itself to be able to have that kind of ISO performance with that high resolution of a sensor. That's all I have for dynamic range and ISO. So let's go ahead and answer the ending question here for the video, which is, should you get the D850 or the Nikon D810? And that really comes down to a few key things. So I was presented with that same question, but I already owned a D810, and I chose to pass on the D850 for 6 or 7 months after it came out. And the only reason I got it is because I found the opportunity to sell my D810, and the same week I sold a musical instrument that I had, a Paul Reed Smith guitar that I let go. And so I didn't have to really pay extra money for this. I just traded gear and got the D850. But if I was a new shooter, or I just had an old Nikon D5000 series camera or something, and I'm finally ready to upgrade and I don't have a D810, I would say go with a D850. Now, there's a couple of caveats there, okay? If you have a specific budget for a camera and the D850 maxes it out, then I would say find a used D810 or a D800E and focus on your glass, because Nikon glass is going to be the most important thing. Get the D800E, D810, something like that, and then spend the money on a Nikon 24-70, the Zeiss Milvus Primes like I have. Get really nice glass and then talk about the camera second. But again, if budget is no option and you're just asking me should you get the D850 or the D810, it's obvious, and the obvious answer is the D850. The only reason why someone would want to go with the D810 is for two reasons. Number one, the price, and number two, if you have some weird fetish with pop-up flashes, because that's about it. It's just price and the pop-up flash are the only two things that are gonna intrigue someone to go with the D810 over the D850. Everything else has been improved significantly, and I've been extremely, extremely impressed with this camera. Just some closing thoughts. So over the past 2 months, the main subjects that I've been shooting with this, other than my family and stuff like that, have been waterfall photography. And someone actually, it's funny because on the day that I almost fell into a river, someone messaged me and said, hey, have you been able to test out the weather sealing on the D850? Because I'm a little bit concerned about the screen on the back, with water or whatever. And so I involuntarily got to try out the weather sealing on the D850. The day that I almost fell into a river, the D850 actually got splashed with a huge gulp of water because in order to catch myself, I basically had to jump off of one rock and jump into the river. And I was just hoping that it wasn't going to be a deep part of the river. It was about 6 or 7 inches deep. And since I jumped, my D850 was out at the time, and it just covered it. It was in my hand like this, and it just got covered. And that was weeks ago, and it's still just, plowing on strong like the powerhouse that it is. So yeah, weather sealing works great. I got to the same thing with the D810. If you guys saw the video where I got soaked with salt water with the D810, it's just like that is. I'm just not worried about it. So I've just had a blast shooting with this camera. Really, it's just really impressed me. So yeah, to conclude my review, Love this camera. I would recommend it to anyone. It's just fantastic on every front. I mean, I really am impressed with it. So, all right, well, if you guys have any questions, as always, leave them in the comments. And thank you guys so much for watching this video. I'll see you guys in the next one.